On July 16, 2026, the U.S. launched a sixth consecutive night of strikes against Iran to further degrade Iranian military capabilities. While CENTCOM forces redirected 3 commercial vessels they said were attempting to bypass the blockade, disabling 1 non-compliant ship and boarding another in the Gulf of Oman. Iranian media reported a suspected U.S. attack on a bridge in the Bandar-e-Kamir region, alongside explosions across southern Iran, including 10 on Keshem Island and others in Bushehr and Ahvaz. The news was dramatic, but hardly surprising. Washington and Tehran have been attacking each other every day for nearly a week. The first major breach came after attacks linked to commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. The United States answered with fresh strikes on Iranian military targets. Iran retaliated. Washington struck again. Tehran responded once more. By mid-July, what had been advertised as a ceasefire had turned into yet another cycle of retaliation. For years, President Trump has had a favorite phrase whenever negotiations reached a deadlock. You don't have the cards right now. Political rivals didn't have the cards. Foreign governments didn't have the cards. America's adversaries, he argued, simply lacked the leverage to force Washington into compromise. But as the conflict with Iran continues to escalate, the metaphor takes on an unexpected twist. The question is no longer whether Iran has any cards left. The more interesting question is whether the United States is running short of good ones. This is not to suggest that America has become weak. It remains the world's preeminent military power, capable of projecting force almost anywhere on the globe. If Washington chose to launch another round of airstrikes tomorrow, it almost certainly could. But every option still available to Washington comes with a cost. America still has cards in its hand, but many of them have become painfully expensive to play. It is no longer simply a contest of military strength. It is a test of strategic choices, political endurance, and economic resilience. Let's take a look at what cards the U.S. still has up its sleeve. Card number 1. Keep bombing military targets. Of all the options available to Washington, this is by far the safest, and the one already being played. Since the latest escalation began, U.S. strikes have largely focused on military objectives: missile launchers, drone production facilities, command centers, logistics hubs, air defense systems, and other assets directly connected to Iran's ability to conduct military operations. From a purely military perspective, the logic is straightforward. Every destroyed missile launcher is one less launcher capable of firing. Every damaged drone factory slows production. Every disrupted command center complicates Iran's ability to coordinate future attacks. The advantages of this strategy are obvious. First, it allows the United States to apply continuous pressure while avoiding the enormous political and military risks associated with a ground war. Air power can be projected quickly. Casualties among U.S. personnel remain comparatively low, and the campaign can be expanded or scaled back depending on political circumstances. Second, these strikes steadily increase the cost of continued confrontation for Iran. Even if individual facilities can eventually be rebuilt, reconstruction consumes time, money, engineering resources, and industrial capacity. Over months rather than days, those costs begin to accumulate. Yet this strategy also has an equally obvious weakness. Military infrastructure can be destroyed, but political determination is much harder to bomb. Iran has spent decades preparing for exactly this type of conflict. Missile production is dispersed across multiple facilities. Many military assets are hardened or buried underground. Equipment can be relocated, command structures decentralized, and production resumed elsewhere. Complete destruction of an opponent's military capacity is extraordinarily difficult, unless accompanied by a much broader campaign. More importantly, history offers numerous examples where sustained air campaigns inflicted heavy damage without producing the desired political outcome. Bombing can weaken an adversary's capabilities, but it does not automatically compel its leaders to change course. Sometimes the opposite occurs. The attacks reinforce the government's determination to endure. This creates an uncomfortable paradox for Washington. The military campaign may continue to achieve tactical successes while producing diminishing strategic returns. Each additional strike may destroy another warehouse, another radar station, or another missile depot, yet leave the central political problem essentially unchanged. The result is a strategy that can manage the conflict but may struggle to conclude it. Card number 2. Bomb Fordow. If ordinary military targets represent the low-risk option, then Fordow represents the opposite. Built deep beneath layers of rock and reinforced concrete, it was designed from the beginning with one purpose in mind: surviving an air campaign. Its location is itself a strategic statement. Iran assumed long ago that one day someone might try to destroy it. For that reason, Fordow has become more than just another nuclear installation. It has become a symbol. From Washington's perspective, striking Fordow would send a powerful message that no facility is beyond American reach. Militarily, disabling the site could delay parts of Iran's nuclear program and demonstrate the effectiveness of U.S. long-range strike capabilities. Yet even here, the picture is far more complicated than it first appears. Military analysts have long debated how much damage could realistically be inflicted on such a deeply buried complex. Specialized bunker-penetrating munitions can reach hardened targets, but facilities constructed inside mountains are among the most challenging objectives in modern warfare. Even successful strikes may require repeated attacks, and there remains uncertainty over whether underground infrastructure could be completely eliminated or merely rendered temporarily unusable. Suppose, however, that the operation succeeded beyond expectations and Fordow were severely damaged. Would that end Iran's nuclear ambitions? Probably not. Buildings can be destroyed. Machinery can be destroyed. Scientists, engineers, accumulated technical expertise, and decades of institutional knowledge are far harder to erase. This is why Fordow presents Washington with a strategic dilemma rather than an obvious solution. Bombing the facility might achieve an important military objective, but it would almost certainly be viewed in Tehran as one of the most serious escalations of the conflict. Iran would face intense domestic pressure to respond, increasing the risk of a broader regional confrontation. Instead of ending the crisis, a successful strike could simply move both sides into an even more dangerous phase. Fordow therefore represents one of America's most powerful military cards, but also one of its riskiest. Card 3. Choke Iran's oil exports. If Fordow targets Iran's long-term strategic ambitions, then Iran's oil exports target something much more immediate: money. Reduce that income dramatically, and Tehran's ability to sustain military operations, subsidize its economy, and absorb the costs of war comes under increasing strain. That is why Karg Island occupies such an important place on the strategic map. For decades, it has served as Iran's primary oil export terminal. A large share of the country's crude reaches international markets through this single hub. From a military perspective, it presents an obvious vulnerability. If exports through Karg were severely disrupted, whether through repeated airstrikes, maritime interdiction, or other forms of military pressure, Iran's financial position would likely deteriorate rapidly. On paper, this may appear to be one of Washington's strongest cards. The problem is that oil markets do not recognize national borders. Iranian oil leaving the market does not affect only Iran. Reduced supply can tighten global energy markets, increase shipping insurance costs, and contribute to higher oil prices worldwide. America's allies in Europe and Asia would feel the effects almost immediately, as would major importers throughout the global economy. Even more significant is the military risk. Any serious attempt to shut down Iran's oil exports would almost certainly increase tensions around the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has repeatedly signaled that if its own exports are threatened, it possesses multiple ways to complicate maritime traffic through one of the world's most important energy corridors. Even limited disruption could send shockwaves through international markets. In other words, choking Iran's oil exports remains a powerful strategic option, but it is not a cost-free one. It is less like flipping a switch and more like pulling a lever connected to the entire global energy system. Once that lever is pulled, nobody, not Washington, not Tehran, not America's allies, and not the international economy, can be entirely certain where events will stop. Card 4. Strike critical infrastructure. If choking oil exports is economic warfare, then striking critical infrastructure is an attempt to increase pressure from the inside. Every modern country depends on an intricate network of power plants, railways, bridges, ports, communication systems, fuel depots, and transportation hubs. From a purely military perspective, the logic is straightforward. A missile factory without electricity produces very few missiles. A military base without fuel cannot easily deploy vehicles. Damaged transportation networks slow logistics, while disrupted communications complicate command and control. Yet this is also the point where military calculations begin colliding with political reality. Railways move soldiers, but they also transport food. Electrical grids power defense industries, but they also keep hospitals operating. Ports handle military cargo alongside commercial imports. The more extensive the disruption becomes, the harder it is to avoid broader humanitarian consequences. Infrastructure damage that significantly affects civilians can reduce international support, invite legal scrutiny, and strengthen criticism from allies whose backing Washington may still need. Military success achieved at the expense of political legitimacy often proves less valuable than expected. There is another strategic question as well. Would attacks on infrastructure actually force Iran's leadership to compromise? History offers no simple answer. Economic hardship can increase domestic pressure on governments, but it can also encourage leaders to portray the conflict as a national struggle, requiring greater sacrifice. In some cases, external attacks have strengthened internal solidarity rather than weakened it. Card 5. Send ground troops. If airstrikes don't work, why not simply invade? On paper, the United States certainly possesses the capability to launch a large-scale military operation. In practice, however, this is the option that most defense analysts regard as the least attractive. The reason begins with geography. Iran is not a small coastal state that can be quickly overrun. It occupies more than 1.6 million square kilometers, making it several times larger than Iraq. Much of the country consists of rugged mountains, deserts, and difficult terrain that naturally complicate military operations. Large cities are scattered across enormous distances, creating formidable logistical challenges even after initial combat has ended. Then, there is the population. With roughly 90 million people, Iran is home to more than twice as many inhabitants as Iraq had before the 2003 invasion. Any discussion of occupation immediately becomes a discussion of governing, policing, supplying, and stabilizing a country of continental scale. Winning the opening campaign would almost certainly be only the beginning of a far longer and more expensive undertaking. Iran possesses missiles capable of targeting regional military bases, drones that could continue operating during a prolonged conflict, and numerous asymmetric capabilities developed precisely to complicate an invasion. Even if U.S. forces achieved rapid battlefield successes, they would still face the prospect of a lengthy campaign requiring enormous logistical support and sustained political commitment. And that may be the greatest obstacle of all. Card 6. Return to negotiations. Return to negotiations too early, and domestic critics may argue that military pressure was abandoned before producing meaningful concessions. Wait too long, and both sides may become so invested in escalation that compromise becomes politically impossible. The difficulty lies in timing. Washington wants Iran to believe that continued confrontation carries unacceptable costs. Tehran wants Washington to conclude that those costs will continue rising for as long as the conflict persists. Neither side wishes to appear to be the first to blink. That is why diplomacy, despite being the least dramatic option on the list, may ultimately prove the most difficult card to play. It requires not only finding terms both governments can accept, but also persuading domestic audiences that compromise does not equal defeat. In international politics, that is often the hardest negotiation of all. By this point, one conclusion becomes increasingly clear. The United States has not run out of cards. Far from it. Airstrikes can continue. Fordow remains a potential target. Oil exports can be disrupted. Infrastructure can be placed under greater pressure. Even a ground invasion, however unlikely, remains theoretically possible. Diplomacy itself has never disappeared from the table. The real question is no longer how many cards America still possesses. It is why every remaining card seems considerably more expensive than the last. Tehran has never attempted to match the United States tank for tank, aircraft carrier for aircraft carrier, or fighter jet for fighter jet. Such a competition would be impossible to win. Instead, Iran has spent years building a strategy around a different question. How do you complicate the plans of an opponent who is much stronger than you? Card 1. Geography. Unlike many countries in the Middle East, Iran is protected by geography that naturally complicates military operations. Mountain ranges divide much of the country. Vast deserts separate major population centers. Long coastlines stretch along the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, while important military facilities are dispersed across enormous distances. For an attacking force, this matters enormously. Every additional kilometer requires more fuel, more logistics, more supply lines, and more personnel. Every mountain creates new defensive positions. Every tunnel, valley, or underground complex increases uncertainty about what lies beyond the next ridge. Geography cannot prevent airstrikes, but it can make every military campaign longer, more expensive, and more complicated. Card 2. The Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway connects the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman and the wider Indian Ocean. It is one of the world's most important maritime choke points, carrying roughly 1/5 of globally traded oil, along with substantial volumes of liquefied natural gas. Contrary to popular belief, Iran cannot simply declare the strait closed and expect the world to accept it. International shipping routes are governed by international law, and many nations have both legal and strategic interests in keeping this corridor open. But permanent control is not necessary to create leverage. Iran's objective has never been to own the strait. Its leverage comes from uncertainty. Every time tensions rise, shipping companies reassess risks. Insurance premiums increase. Tankers alter routes where possible. Energy traders react. Financial markets begin calculating worst-case scenarios. In other words, Iran does not need to halt global energy flows to influence them. That uncertainty has become one of Iran's most valuable strategic assets. Card 3. Missiles and drones. Over the past 2 decades, Iran has invested heavily in missiles and unmanned aerial systems rather than attempting to build an air force capable of competing directly with the United States. They are generally less expensive to produce, easier to disperse across multiple locations, and capable of threatening military bases, shipping, and regional infrastructure from considerable distances. No missile defense system offers perfect protection. Intercepting incoming projectiles is itself costly, and defenders often expend interceptors worth far more than the drones or missiles they are attempting to destroy. This creates a form of cost asymmetry. The attacker may spend relatively little to compel the defender to spend much more. Rather than seeking overwhelming battlefield victories, they raise the cost of continued military operations for the opposing side. Card 4. Endurance. Iran has spent decades learning how to function under economic restrictions. The country continues to produce much of its own food, maintains strategic reserves of key commodities, and has developed domestic industries in sectors where imports became unreliable. None of this makes Iran economically comfortable, but it does make the economy more accustomed to operating under pressure than many outsiders assume. Iran deliberately dispersed many defense-related activities across multiple locations and invested heavily in hardened infrastructure long before the current conflict. Those preparations complicate efforts to measure the overall impact. The more realistic assessment is neither that Iran can fight indefinitely without consequence, nor that economic collapse is imminent. It may continue standing for quite some time. Card 5. Playing the long game. Perhaps Iran's most underestimated card cannot be photographed by satellites or counted by intelligence agencies. It is time. In the United States, every major foreign policy decision exists alongside public opinion, congressional oversight, budget debates, and election cycles. Rising fuel prices, extended military commitments, or mounting uncertainty abroad inevitably become domestic political issues. Iran's political system operates under a different rhythm. Its leadership certainly faces internal political pressures and economic challenges, but it does not confront national elections on the same timetable or under the same institutional constraints as the United States. That difference can influence strategic decision-making. Policies that impose long-term economic hardship may still carry significant political risks, yet leaders may evaluate those risks over different time horizons. From Tehran's perspective, Merely convincing Washington that the conflict will remain expensive, uncertain, and politically difficult may itself constitute a strategic success. If the United States now imports only a relatively small share of its oil directly from the Persian Gulf, why remain so deeply involved in protecting the Strait of Hormuz? The answer lies in the difference between buying oil and pricing oil. Oil is traded in a global market. Even if a barrel never reaches an American refinery from the Gulf, disruptions there affect worldwide prices. Reduced supply in one region influences prices everywhere else. Consumers in Asia, Europe, and North America all feel the consequences through interconnected energy markets. But economics is only part of the story. The Strait of Hormuz is also a test of the broader international order that the United States has supported for decades. Since the end of the Second World War, successive American administrations, Republican and Democratic alike, have generally defended the principle that major international sea lanes should remain open to commercial navigation. The objective extends beyond oil. It concerns predictability, trade, and the stability of global commerce. If a major maritime choke point could be effectively controlled through military coercion, governments around the world would begin asking uncomfortable questions. Would other strategic waterways become vulnerable to similar pressure? Would allies continue believing that international shipping routes could remain open during future crises? Would rival powers conclude that economic leverage had become an increasingly effective geopolitical weapon? These questions help explain why Washington has consistently viewed freedom of navigation as a strategic interest rather than merely an energy issue. The United States is not simply reacting to today's oil shipments. It is thinking about tomorrow's international rules. If electoral consequences become less immediate after the midterm elections, would the White House have greater freedom to pursue tougher policies toward Iran? Possibly. But the answer is not nearly that simple. One school of thought argues that once an election is passed, presidents often gain additional room to make difficult or unpopular decisions because the next nationwide campaign remains some distance away. Under this view, reduced electoral pressure can increase strategic flexibility. Another school of thought reaches almost the opposite conclusion. If the governing party performs poorly in the midterms, the administration may encounter greater congressional scrutiny, more contentious budget negotiations, and a more complicated political environment. Major military initiatives often require sustained financial resources and long-term political support, both of which can become harder to secure when domestic politics grow more polarized. Neither outcome is predetermined. Much depends on the scale of the election result, public attitudes toward the conflict, economic conditions, and developments on the battlefield itself. In the end, Washington's decisions will not be shaped solely by what happens in Tehran. They will also be shaped by what happens in Congress, in financial markets, at gasoline stations, and ultimately inside voting booths. Sometimes the decisive front line lies thousands of miles away from the battlefield itself. After examining the military, economic, and political dimensions of this conflict, we can finally return to the question posed at the very beginning. Does the United States still have cards left to play against Iran? The answer is clearly yes. However, with almost every remaining option, the cost continues to rise. Iran has not found a painless strategy. It has simply found one that seeks to raise the cost of victory for its opponent. Perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of the current confrontation. Power is not measured by how many cards remain in your hand. Power is measured by whether any of the cards you still hold are worth playing. And at this stage of the U.S.-Iran confrontation, that may be the most difficult question facing both Washington and Tehran.